October 21st, 1944. The ridge looked like it was on fire. Columns of black smoke twisted above shattered palms, the ground vibrating under the constant thud of Japanese shells. Leaves fell like ash. The smell of burnt metal and cordite filled the air, mixing with sweat and fear. Private First Class Raymond Keller crouched beside his howitzer, his face streaked with grime, eyes fixed on the horizon where invisible guns were tearing his position apart. Every countershot failed. Every correction fell short. The Japanese battery had the higher ground and the upper hand. Behind him, someone cursed. Another loaded a shell, and Keller made a decision no training had prepared him for. He reached for the elevation crank and twisted it far beyond standard. A reckless move. A stupid trick, his crew would later call it. The round vanished into the clouds. Then came a single thunderclap that shook the valley. Where moments ago enemy flashes burned, there was now only silence and rising smoke. That morning, one gunner's instinct changed the rhythm of battle. By late 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most punishing phase. The Japanese Empire, though battered, still clung to the outer defenses of its once vast perimeter. From New Guinea to the Marianas, island after island had fallen to the relentless advance of American forces. Now, all eyes turned to the Philippines. Sprawling archipelago whose liberation would sever Japan's southern resource lifeline and bring Allied bombers within range of Tokyo itself. The invasion of Leyte was more than another amphibious landing. It was a promise kept. General Douglas MacArthur had sworn to return after his forced retreat in 1942, and the campaign began that October with one of the largest naval and air operations of the entire war. But beyond the famous beach landings and the grand speeches, it was the brutal inland fighting, the close, mud-choked, nerve-shattering duels between artillery and infantry that defined the battle's true cost. Leyte's terrain was a nightmare for gunners. Tropical, humidity ruined fuses. Heavy rains turned roads into rivers of mud, swallowing trucks whole. Jungles devoured visibility. Ridgelines broke line of sight. The Japanese, masters of concealment, dug their batteries into hillsides and camouflaged them with such precision that even reconnaissance aircraft often missed them. For American artillerymen trained on open European ranges, this was an alien war. Every adjustment was a guess, every correction a gamble. Forward observers, their lifeline for targeting, were often cut off or killed. When shells landed short, the men didn't curse their guns. They cursed the terrain. In those first days on Leyte, entire units found themselves firing at flashes rather than coordinates, relying on instinct, not instruments. It was a war of elevation and angle, where a few degrees could mean the difference between missing by a mile or wiping out an unseen enemy. The 105mm howitzer crews bore the brunt of this chaotic adaptation. Designed for versatility, these guns were the backbone of American field artillery. Each could hurl a 15-kilogram shell more than 7 miles, but only if the gunners could see or calculate their target correctly. Against the Japanese batteries hidden in the ridges north of Dulag, correctly was a luxury they seldom had. For days, the duel continued. Allied infantry tried to advance up narrow trails, only to be shredded by hidden fire. Machine gun nests pinned them down. Mortars rained without warning. Artillery batteries supporting them worked in constant rotation. Fire, shift, reload, relocate, trying to locate the enemy that refused to reveal itself. Among these exhausted men was Raymond Keller's crew. Their position overlooked a valley scarred by bombardment, its floor littered with shattered trucks and burned ammunition crates. Communications were thin. Maps were outdated. Their radio operator had been wounded 2 days earlier. Every shell they fired was plotted by hand, every correction scribbled in dirt. The pressure mounted with each passing hour. Supplies ran low and fatigue crept in. The Japanese artillery, firing from higher ground, seemed untouchable. Their rounds screamed overhead with the sound that soldiers came to recognize instantly: the whistle of a shell that knew where it was going. By the morning of October 21st, the situation had reached breaking point. Keller's battery had been ordered to hold fire until spotting teams could locate the enemy's exact position. But as shells continued to rain down on their ridge, holding fire meant waiting to die. It was during this desperate silence, amid shattered palm trunks and the smell of cordite, that Keller began studying the smoke columns in the distance. The enemy guns were invisible, yet the sound of their fire, the echo, and the smoke pattern gave him an idea. Something unorthodox, something bordering on reckless. He knew that standard firing angles weren't reaching far enough to crest the Japanese ridge. But if he pushed elevation far higher than regulation, the shell might descend almost vertically, landing behind the enemy's cover. It wasn't genius. It was instinct, born of exhaustion and survival. And it was about to make history on that ridge in Leyte. The ridge Keller's crew occupied sat on the southern shoulder of the Dulag Valley, a vital corridor for the U.S. Army's advance inland from the beaches. Behind them, landing craft still unloaded supplies under the watchful eyes of Navy gunners. Ahead lay a labyrinth of ravines and coconut groves concealing Japanese strongpoints. What maps showed as gentle slopes were, in truth, tangled jungles of mud, rock, and bamboo, terrain that devoured movement and swallowed strategy. The Japanese 16th Division had prepared for this fight long before the first American boots touched the sand. Their artillery, mostly Type 92 105mm howitzers, and captured British 75mm guns, were positioned on elevated ground overlooking the approaches to Dulag. Camouflaged firing pits blended seamlessly into the earth. Guns were dragged uphill by hand, dismantled and reassembled under cover of night. Every shell was pre-ranged, every sector of approach zeroed in. They knew the terrain like an extension of their own skin. For the Americans, this meant every advance was met by an invisible wall of steel. Mortars and artillery would erupt without warning, forcing entire companies to dive for cover. Engineers cleared paths only to see them obliterated minutes later. The battle had devolved into a contest of nerves and angles, one where the higher gun usually won. The artillerymen of the 24th Infantry Division, to which Keller belonged, worked in shifts that blurred days into nights. Their positions were never safe. Counterfire was constant. Gunners slept beside their weapons, knowing that at any moment an incoming shell could erase their section completely. Rain turned shell craters into stagnant pools. Mosquitoes and exhaustion filled the silence between bombardments. Despite the misery, their mission was crucial. Artillery wasn't just support, it was survival. Every infantryman pinned in a rice field, every patrol lost in the jungle, depended on the accuracy of those guns. And accuracy, under those conditions, was often a myth. Observers on nearby ridges radioed coordinates that changed by the minute, distorted by smoke or shifting landmarks. Compass bearings failed under magnetic interference from shrapnel. Range tables became guesses scribbled with mud-stained pencils. Gunners fired by feel, adjusting with every shot, learning through the rhythm of recoil and the sound of impact. In that chaos, innovation wasn't optional. It was survival instinct. Crews found themselves experimenting with elevation angles, fuse delays, and charge increments in ways their training manuals had never imagined. Some called it improvisation, others called it madness. But the results spoke louder than doctrine. The Japanese, for their part, respected and feared American artillery. Their own counter-battery tactics relied on concealment and deception rather than direct duels. When they fired, it was short, violent bursts. 3 or 4 shells, then silence. By the time the Americans returned fire, the enemy crews had already vanished into the jungle. This hit-and-run rhythm frustrated commanders, but taught field gunners like Keller something vital. Survival belonged to those who could adapt fastest. He'd watched older sergeants tinker with fuse settings, experiment with steeper trajectories, or angle their guns using improvised levels made from spent shell casings and canteens of water. None of it was in the manual, but it worked. By mid-October, as the Battle of Leyte raged, Keller's battery had endured more than 50 separate bombardments. They'd seen comrades buried under landslides caused by near misses. They'd watched radio lines melt under fire. Yet they remained, holding the ridge with stubborn, mechanical precision. Then came the morning that would define them. Reports filtered in of a Japanese battery firing from a ridge roughly 200 yards north, its rounds devastating an American column attempting to cross open ground. Air support was unavailable. Fog grounded observation planes. The counterfire task fell to Keller's crew. The coordinates were uncertain. The ridge was too steep, the vegetation too dense. Yet the order was clear: neutralize the battery, immediately. Keller checked the range tables, then looked toward the thick smoke drifting from the northern slope. Every prior attempt to hit that ridge had failed. The enemy's position lay behind natural cover, invisible to direct fire. As the first shells left their barrels, Keller watched them vanish into the jungle, each explosion landing too short. He adjusted elevation, fired again, still short. Every correction seemed useless. But as the echoes rolled across the valley, he noticed something others missed: the pattern of the returning sound. It was faint but distinct. The Japanese guns weren't firing from the top. They were buried behind it. That realization, born in seconds amid chaos, would lead to the decision that changed everything. For Raymond Keller, the war wasn't about strategy or maps. It was about survival and instinct. Like many field gunners, he'd never imagined himself shaping tactics that historians would later study. He was a farm boy from Iowa who learned to gauge wind by watching cornfields sway, who could tell the slope of land by how rainwater pooled. On Leyte, those instincts mattered more than any classroom lesson. The ridge shook beneath him. Each blast from Japanese artillery scattered dirt over his crew, the sound of steel striking earth echoing in their ribs. Keller wasn't fearless. He was simply focused. Fear was background noise, something to ignore between shell bursts. When he looked through the gun sight, he saw not targets, but rhythm, impact, smoke, echo. War reduced everything to reaction time and gut feeling. The stupid trick would later be remembered as calculated brilliance, but in that moment, it was desperation shaped by experience. His hands moved before thought did. What he felt wasn't courage. It was a grim necessity to act when hesitation meant death. That's what separated survivors from casualties on Leyte. The ability to trust an instinct no textbook endorsed. Artillery duels in the Pacific demanded a new kind of thinking. Traditional doctrine emphasized precision based on line of sight, elevation charts, and forward observer reports. But Leyte's ridges made such procedures nearly impossible. Visibility rarely extended beyond 100 meters. Radio communication was spotty, and Japanese counter-battery fire was immediate. Crews like Keller's learned to operate in near-total isolation, relying on the landscape's natural sounds. When a shell landed, they listened, not just for impact, but for the echo's delay and tone. A sharper, shorter echo meant hard ground. A dull, drawn-out one hinted at deeper jungle or distance. These auditory cues, though unscientific, became lifelines. The Japanese batteries exploited the terrain expertly, using reverse slopes to shield themselves. American shells often slammed harmlessly into the forward face of a ridge, while enemy rounds sailed cleanly over. It became a deadly geometry lesson, one solved not by mathematics, but by the creativity of gunners under fire. Keller's trick was essentially a crude form of high-angle fire, an adaptation of mortar-like trajectory with a howitzer not designed for it. He wasn't just shooting higher. He was bending the very logic of his weapon. The shell would drop almost vertically, arcing behind the ridge to strike the unseen battery. A maneuver unthinkable to most, yet precisely what the situation demanded. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer, Keller's weapon, was the workhorse of American artillery. Rugged, reliable, and mobile, it could fire a shell weighing over 30 pounds with a maximum range of roughly 7 miles. Its standard firing elevation ranged from 0 to 66 degrees. Beyond that, accuracy and recoil stability became unpredictable. That limitation existed for good reason. Exceeding it risked damage to the carriage, unpredictable shell flight, or catastrophic misfire. But Keller understood something subtle. In the humid, dense air of the tropics, shell drag behaved differently. Elevation tables, designed for temperate climates, underestimated how air density affected trajectory. By increasing elevation and reducing propellant charge, he altered the parabola, raising the shell's apex and softening its descent. The round would fall nearly straight down, striking behind the protective slope that had sheltered the Japanese guns. It wasn't magic. It was physics applied under pressure. This unorthodox adjustment turned a standard field gun into a weapon, capable of lobbing shells over obstacles once thought untouchable. It was the kind of innovation that emerged only when battlefield necessity collided with mechanical curiosity. Keller wasn't defying doctrine for glory. He was testing the limits of steel, powder, and mathematics in real time. These three angles, human, tactical, and technological, intertwined in the smoke and chaos of that ridge. One man's intuition, one crew's discipline, and one weapon's adaptability aligned in a single moment of improvisation. And as the echoes of their high-angle salvo faded over Leyte's ravines, another story began forming across the ridge, the perspective of those on the receiving end. From the Japanese side, the battery was a testament to ingenuity and patience. Concealed deep in the northern ridges of Dulag, gunners had spent weeks digging, camouflaging, and pre-ranging their howitzers. Each emplacement was carefully designed to maximize concealment while maintaining fields of fire over the valley below. The enemy crews believed themselves untouchable, hidden behind reverse slopes and thick foliage. Their discipline was meticulous. Shells were preloaded and aimed at likely American approach routes. Each crewman knew his sector, every observer trained to relay corrections quickly. From their position, the jungle was both shield and trap, providing cover but also isolating them from reinforcements. They relied on stealth, surprise, and timing. Yet even the most disciplined soldiers could not account for improvisation born of desperation. When Keller's shells struck the ridge behind their emplacement, the Japanese gunners initially assumed a misfire or accident. Confusion spread in seconds, orders faltered, and the tightly synchronized defense unraveled. One unexpected trajectory, one arc higher than any manual allowed, exposed them completely. This moment illustrated the fragile balance in warfare. Skill, preparation, and experience could be rendered irrelevant by unpredictability. A single adjustment by an enemy gunner could overturn weeks of careful planning, forcing a retreat or surrender. American command structures relied on hierarchy and observation. Battery commanders were trained to monitor fire, adjust trajectories, and protect their crews. In the chaos of Leyte, however, the chain of command was strained. Radio lines were cut, officers wounded, and decisions often fell to the youngest men on the line. Keller's action exemplified decentralized leadership under extreme conditions. Without orders, he assessed the situation, made a rapid decision, and executed it. His success depended not only on skill but also on trust, both from his crew and from the implicit confidence that small units must exercise when larger command cannot intervene. This type of battlefield, autonomy was rare in doctrine but critical in practice. Officers observed from behind, providing broad guidance, yet the individual gunner's judgment often determined survival or destruction. Keller's adjustment demonstrated that leadership on the ground was as much about intuition and timing as it was about rank. War on Leyte was as much mental as it was physical. Fatigue, fear, and the constant stress of artillery duels shaped behavior. Soldiers developed rituals to cope, checking sights repeatedly, murmuring prayers, or silently counting rounds. The psychological strain was immense. Keller's stupid trick highlighted the interplay between fear and instinct. His crew, initially skeptical, had to trust a decision that defied standard procedure. Success hinged on overcoming doubt, embracing risk, and acting decisively. The effect extended beyond the immediate kill zone. Witnessing the destruction of the Japanese battery instilled confidence among nearby units, showing that audacity, ingenuity, and calm judgment could prevail even against entrenched, invisible enemies. Morale, fragile as it was in the tropics, surged after that moment. In one instant, a single act of calculated risk reshaped perception. Innovation and courage were weapons as effective as any shell. These angles, enemy, leadership, and psychological, intersected with the human, tactical and technological perspectives. Each layer deepened the understanding of what that ridge in Leyte truly represented. A crucible where instinct, skill, and creativity collided. The stage was set for the decisive moment, the action that would destroy the hidden battery and echo through history. The morning sun glinted off the mist rising from the Dulag Valley, illuminating the shattered palms and mud-choked trails below. Raymond Keller's crew crouched beside the 105mm howitzer, hands black with grease, faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Each man understood the stakes. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and the Japanese guns would continue to shred advancing infantry columns, turning their ridge into a tomb. Keller gripped the elevation crank. Every previous adjustment had failed. Each shell had fallen short or struck the wrong slope. The Japanese battery remained invisible, obscured by the jungle and reverse ridges. Observation reports were fragmented, radio lines cracked with static. The officers had offered advice, but command was distant, unable to see what lay ahead. He whispered a single word to himself, almost a taunt. Higher. Turning the crank far beyond regulation, he elevated the barrel to an angle no training manual recommended. It was a maneuver that risked backlash, mechanical failure, or outright misfire. His crew glanced nervously. "That's stupid," one muttered, gripping the recoil brake. Yet Keller's eyes never wavered. He had calculated, by ear, by feel, and by the faint patterns of smoke from prior enemy rounds, where the shell would land. The first shot arced sharply, disappearing into the clouds above the ridgeline. For a heartbeat, there was silence, only the distant thunder of earlier bombardments. Then the shell struck with a deafening roar. Trees exploded, earth erupted, and smoke billowed high. The sound echoed through the valley like a rolling avalanche. Keller's second shell followed, tracing a similar path. The Japanese battery, long thought secure, was suddenly exposed. Crews scrambled from their emplacements, shouting and firing sporadically. But it was too late. The howitzer rounds struck with uncanny accuracy, landing behind their cover and cutting through ammunition stores and gun positions alike. The ridge seemed alive with chaos, the air filled with smoke, fire, and debris. Japanese artillery pieces toppled under the impact. Shells misfired or were engulfed in flames. For the Americans on the lower ridge, the roar was both terrifying and exhilarating. Every round that struck shifted the balance of power in the valley. By the third shot, Keller's crew moved with the confidence of experience fused with instinct. Each shell followed the same deadly arc, striking the ridge at angles no one had anticipated. The Japanese defenders, trapped between their own guns and the sudden onslaught, attempted counterfire, but their visibility was gone. and communication between positions had collapsed. Observers later reported that what unfolded on that ridge lasted no more than 10 minutes. Yet, in that brief span, one gunner's daring had neutralized a well-entrenched battery that had threatened the advance of hundreds of soldiers. The stupid trick with elevation was no longer reckless. It was decisive. As smoke and flame consumed the Japanese emplacements, Keller lowered the barrel, his hands shaking from exertion and adrenaline. Around him, the valley lay stunned. Silence replaced the deadly cadence of fire. The ridge had changed, the enemy's power had vanished, and the path forward for American forces widened. The destruction was total. The carefully constructed Japanese positions, camouflaged, elevated, and deadly, were now nothing more than charred craters. Survivors retreated, demoralized and disoriented, unable to regroup under the relentless, high-arching bombardment. In the aftermath, Keller's crew understood the enormity of what had just occurred. A single decision, executed with nerve and precision, had altered the tactical landscape of Leyte. The battlefield had shifted in minutes, proof that instinct, courage, and technical understanding could outweigh even the most prepared defensive positions. The echoes of the high-angle shots faded, leaving only smoke, fire, and the trembling palms that had witnessed history. The valley fell silent, broken only by the crackle of flames consuming fallen trees and shattered gun positions. Smoke rose in thick columns, hiding the devastation below. Japanese gunners, once methodical and precise, now fled in disarray, their carefully constructed defenses obliterated by arcs of steel they had never anticipated. The ridge, a natural fortress, had become a tomb for their artillery. Keller's crew stood frozen for a moment, watching as their shells continued to strike with uncanny precision. Each round landed behind the enemy lines, catching ammunition stores, gun carriages, and personnel alike. The high-angle technique created a vertical strike no conventional direct fire approach could achieve. The once impenetrable ridge was now a smoking ruin, its defenders scattered and helpless. Reports later confirmed the scale of destruction. 4 howitzers were completely destroyed, 2 others damaged beyond repair, and dozens of Japanese soldiers killed or incapacitated. Survivors abandoned their positions entirely, retreating into the dense jungle, leaving the valley clear for advancing American infantry. What had been a carefully coordinated, heavily defended battery was no longer a threat. From the perspective of the American forward observers, the ridge had transformed almost instantaneously. What had seemed impossible, neutralizing a hidden artillery position without direct line of sight, had been achieved in minutes. The tactic exploited both human error and environmental conditions. Dense foliage that concealed the guns also made their precise location guessable only through sound, trajectory, and intuition. The psychological impact was immediate. Nearby units, long pinned by the invisible threat of Japanese fire, now moved forward with renewed confidence. Morale surged, not because the enemy had been killed, but because one gunner's intuition had demonstrated that entrenched positions were not invincible. The lesson was clear. Innovation, boldness, and situational awareness could redefine battlefield outcomes in an instant. Keller's action also forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their approach. Defensive strategies relying on concealment and calculated range were vulnerable to unpredictable arcs of high-angle fire. In subsequent engagements across Leyte, Japanese artillery crews became increasingly cautious, altering their emplacements and retreating more frequently. Fearing similar sudden destruction, the howitzer crew, exhausted but triumphant, took stock of their ridge. The forest that had been torn apart by the blasts now lay in smoke-streaked ruins. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burnt vegetation, and wet earth. Every man knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not a battle won by numbers or brute force, but by a combination of daring, calculation, and instinct. In the minutes following the salvo, the valley settled into an uneasy calm. The Japanese had been neutralized, but the war was far from over. Yet, in those fleeting moments, one ridge in Leyte had been transformed, and one young gunner's reputation cemented. As the smoke lingered and the echo of explosions faded into the jungle canopy, the battlefield held its breath, poised for the next wave of combat. The stage was set for the aftermath, an evaluation of destruction, morale, and the strategic consequences of a single decisive action. When dawn broke over the ridge, the full scale of destruction became visible. Smoke hung low, mixing with morning mist, as the sunlight exposed a landscape completely reshaped by the bombardment. Craters pocked the hillside like open wounds. Twisted fragments of Japanese artillery littered the slope. The bodies of fallen gunners, their positions destroyed mid-firing sequence, told the story of a defeat too sudden to comprehend. The once carefully hidden battery had been erased from existence within minutes. American forward observers arrived by mid-morning, climbing through the charred remains of bamboo and earthworks to verify the result. They found what intelligence officers later described as an artillery position annihilated by indirect precision. The battery's range tables, burnt beyond recognition, still bore pencil markings where Japanese gunners had carefully plotted their firing arcs. Nearby, a shattered rangefinder and melted shell casings offered silent testimony to their futility against the improvised high-angle tactic that had undone them. Word of the feat traveled quickly across American positions. Keller's gun crew, previously one among hundreds, became an example of battlefield ingenuity, a symbol of how adaptation could overcome even the most formidable enemy defenses. Reports circulated up the chain of command, eventually reaching divisional headquarters. Commanders analyzed the technique, documenting how an unconventional elevation change had allowed the howitzer to strike targets invisible to direct sight lines. It was entered into training notes under field adaptation, a rare instance where a soldier's intuition had rewritten engagement doctrine on the spot. For the Japanese defenders, the event carried a different kind of weight. Survivors who retreated deeper into the jungle were shaken by what they described as fire from the heavens. Their artillery confidence, once among the strongest elements of Japanese island defense, was fractured. The ridge, once considered an anchor point of the defensive line, now served as a grim warning that even the best prepared positions were vulnerable to the creativity of an enemy willing to think beyond the textbook. The destruction of the battery opened the valley to Allied advance. Infantry regiments moved through the area within the next 24 hours, encountering minimal resistance. Without artillery cover, the Japanese infantry was exposed, forced to withdraw from nearby trenches and foxholes that now offered no protection against the Americans' advancing armor and air support. In tactical terms, Keller's stupid trick, as he had offhandedly called it, saved lives. Units that had previously suffered heavy shelling losses moved through the cleared zone without taking a single artillery casualty. For commanders overseeing the broader Leyte campaign, it represented a pivotal micro-victory. A single gun crew's improvisation had shifted the momentum in a contested sector, accelerating the collapse of Japanese resistance in that valley. But the psychological effect extended far beyond that one battle. Soldiers who witnessed the result firsthand began experimenting with their own elevation adjustments, testing angles and ranges under field conditions. By the campaign's end, numerous crews had adapted similar high-arc firing methods to neutralize hidden or fortified enemy positions. What began as one man's spontaneous decision evolved into a tactical practice, quietly adopted across multiple batteries. That morning, standing amid the ruins, Keller's crew posed briefly for a photograph taken by a combat correspondent. In the image, later archived in a dusty folder marked Battery C Leyte, the men appeared tired, their uniforms blackened by soot, their expressions neither triumphant nor boastful. Behind them, the ridge still smolders. To an untrained eye, it looks like another war photo. To those who knew the story, it captured a moment when instinct outperformed doctrine. The success, though small in scale compared to the massive operations unfolding elsewhere, encapsulated something greater, a reflection of human adaptability in the chaos of war. And as word spread through the 24th Corps that one gunner's odd decision had broken a Japanese battery in minutes, soldiers across the front began to look differently at their weapons, their angles, and their possibilities. In the days that followed, the ridge remained eerily quiet. Occasional bursts of small arms fire echoed from deeper in the jungle, but the once dominant Japanese artillery was gone. The absence of their thunder was more powerful than any victory song. It symbolized a shift, the moment when American forces finally secured control over the valley that had resisted them for weeks. Recovery teams combed through the remains, documenting every destroyed gun, mapping shell impact points, and collecting fragments for ordnance analysis. Engineers studying the site were astonished at the accuracy achieved through improvised elevation. They noted that the firing arcs, though seemingly irregular, aligned perfectly with the hidden targets, a result of instinct and terrain calculation rather than mathematical precision. In official reports, Keller's maneuver was categorized under unsanctioned adaptive fire, a sterile term that failed to capture the ingenuity behind it. When headquarters received the findings, a brief commendation was drafted, noting exceptional tactical initiative under field conditions. Keller, however, remained largely unaware of the bureaucratic ripple his action caused. To him and his men, it was just another mission, another ridge, another day survived. The war ground on, and the next order was already on its way before the smoke from the ridge had cleared. Yet the impact endured. Artillery instructors studying post-battle assessments from Leyte began including variations of Keller's elevation method in their tactical lectures. The technique wasn't officially named, but among field gunners, it gained quiet fame. The ridge shot. Stories circulated from battery to battery about a crew that turned a hopeless situation into a decisive advantage simply by changing the way they aimed at the impossible. For the Japanese, the psychological scars deepened. Prisoners captured in later engagements spoke of invisible fire that struck from unpredictable angles. The mystique of their once dominant island defenses began to fade. Commanders grew hesitant to establish static artillery positions, fearing they would draw the same sudden, inescapable fate as the Ridge Battery. The fear of unseen destruction gnawed at their morale. War correspondents covering the Leyte campaign often missed the story entirely, focusing instead on the broader landings and the strategic air battles raging overhead. But among artillerymen, the tale spread quietly, carried through mess tents and foxholes, a testament to creativity amid chaos. One crew's innovation had proven that even in the most rigid machinery of war, there was still room for human intuition to make all the difference. When the war ended months later, most of the men from Keller's crew returned home. Some went back to farms, others to factories. A few stayed in the service. Keller himself rarely spoke about the ridge. To those who asked, he described it with a shrug. "We just aimed higher. That's all." His simplicity belied the sophistication of what he had done. A spontaneous redefinition of artillery tactics, born from desperation and executed with precision. Decades later, a historian researching field innovations in the Pacific Theater found the combat photograph buried in an archive. Beneath it, a faint note read, "Battery C, Ridge Engagement. Leyte. Enemy battery destroyed using high elevation. Fire." It was the only written trace of an event that had changed the tide in that valley and influenced countless others who followed. The ridge itself was reclaimed by nature, Jungle vines crept over rusted shell casings, rain filled the craters, and birds nested in the warped remains of the gun pits. The echoes of that day faded into the soil, but the principle it represented endured. That sometimes, in war, genius hides inside what first appears to be a stupid trick. History rarely remembers the small moments that changed everything. Maps record victories, generals earn the headlines, and medals go to names engraved in official reports. But in the smoke and soil of Leyte's ridges, it was one man's intuition, unwritten, unplanned, that redefined what artillery could do. Keller's stupid trick was not born from manuals or orders. It was the product of experience, observation, and a refusal to accept that the unseen could not be hit. In that decision lay the essence of human adaptability, the same trait that has turned soldiers, engineers, and ordinary men into inventors under fire. The ridge became a quiet monument to that spirit, an unmarked testament to the idea that necessity breeds not just courage, but creativity. The tactical innovation he sparked echoed far beyond the Philippines. It served as a reminder that wars are not won solely by weapons, but by minds willing to bend the rules of how those weapons are used. In countless later conflicts, artillery officers studied elevation, trajectory, and topography with a new awareness, that even in the chaos of combat, an idea could shift the balance faster than any order from command. Today, the jungle has reclaimed that battlefield. No plaques, no monuments, just the rusting bones of a vanished war buried beneath roots and moss. Yet, for every soldier who has ever stood before an impossible target and refused to accept defeat, Keller's story still lives. It whispers a truth older than gunpowder itself, that ingenuity, even born from frustration or chance, can shape the fate of nations. And so, in the forgotten silence of a Leyte ridge, the echoes of that stupid trick with elevation remain, proof that sometimes the difference between survival and destruction lies not in what you see, but in how high you dare to aim.